The morning mist lay thin over Wetherby St. Clair, curling about the thatched roofs and creeping down narrow lanes with an almost inquisitive precision. Inspector Purbright arrived at the village square with the careful detachment of a man used to discovering truths buried beneath layers of civility and habit. The occasion, the ceremonial reopening of the parish hall, recently refurbished after an unfortunate fire, was in theory a simple one: a ribbon, a few speeches, and the exchange of polite acknowledgements. In practice, Purbright had long learned, such events were fertile ground for subtle observation, for glimpses of hidden envy, silent resentments, and the deftly veiled ambitions of the ostensibly virtuous. The first thing Purbright noticed before he had even removed his overcoat was the precise manner in which the parish committee had positioned themselves. Each man and woman stood in deliberate spacing, their hands clasped or folded in the prescribed manners of genteel restraint, a tableau of understated authority. Among them moved Mrs. Darnley, the widow, whose reputation for both benevolence and quiet manipulation preceded her, and whose choice of a pale green dress seemed almost designed to draw notice without claiming it outright. She greeted him with a slight nod, one that carried all the warmth of a candle flickering in a draught. Enough to be courteous, but faintly unsettling. "Inspector Purbright," she said, her voice moderated, not quite rising above the gentle murmur of the crowd. "How fortunate that you could attend. The hall, I hope, meets your expectations." "It is, madam," Purbright replied, inclining his head. "Restored with admirable care. I trust it will serve its purpose well." He allowed a pause before adding, dryly, "I imagine the committee has been vigilant." Mrs. Darnley's lips twitched in the merest suggestion of a smile, which he suspected was meant to convey amusement rather than any personal fondness. Around them, the villagers greeted one another with quiet nods and smiles, as if aware that every movement, every inflection carried potential consequence. It was the choreography of small-town civility, perfectly timed, meticulously observed, and never entirely sincere. Purbright's attention drifted briefly to the letters resting upon the committee table. A small, unassuming stack, but the precise order and handwriting suggested private exchange, the kind of discreet correspondence that often contained either gentle entreaties or veiled admonitions. One envelope, cream-coloured and folded with particular care, had been placed so that it caught the sunlight. He could not discern the writer, nor did he try. Merely noting its presence sufficed. There was a weight to such documents, unspoken yet heavily felt by all parties present. A newcomer approached, walking with the unassuming ease of a man accustomed to temporary residence rather than permanent scrutiny. Father Llewellyn, recently arrived and already conspicuous for his unobtrusive attention to detail, offered greetings to the assembled committee. His manner was that of a man entirely polite, entirely observant, entirely unremarkable in any way that might invite complaint. Yet Purbright had seen enough to know that such men often observed more than they revealed. "Good morning, Inspector," he said, inclining his head with that balance of warmth and restraint peculiar to clerical strangers. "I trust I do not intrude." Purbright gestured toward the chairs arrayed at the hall entrance. "Not at all, Father. I expect the event will be more a matter of ceremony than intrusion." Father Llewellyn's glance lingered on the widow for a fraction longer than civility strictly required. Purbright made no note aloud, but his mind catalogued the attention. In small towns, and particularly in towns like Wetherby St. Clair, the duration and subtlety of a look often mattered more than words spoken aloud. The speeches commenced with mild formality. Reverend Henshaw, vicar of the parish, read a brief statement of dedication, carefully avoiding any mention of past misfortune or fire, as if acknowledging such facts would be to taint the present with impropriety. Mrs. Darnley, positioned in the front row, nodded slightly at each point, her hands folded precisely in her lap. A member of the committee, Mr. Collingwood, offered a tentative applause, which was immediately mirrored by the rest. Purbright noticed how the applause, though coordinated, carried the faint tension of performance, a communal effort to maintain the semblance of harmony. When the formalities concluded, tea was offered. The procession to the refreshment table was conducted with the muted grace of an extended ritual. Biscuits were arranged in neat piles, teacups polished, and sugar tongs poised with almost ceremonial exactitude. Purbright accepted tea with a quiet nod, mindful of the village's rules of propriety, which often dictated that any refusal or hesitation might be read as moral judgment or social dissent. Mrs. Darnley presided over the tea table with a calm attention that suggested long practice in both hospitality and scrutiny. She poured the tea with deliberate care, her eyes flicking occasionally toward Father Llewellyn, who accepted the beverage with the faintest sign of hesitation, as though measuring the temperature of social expectation against the liquid's warmth. "It is remarkable," Mrs. Darnley observed, her tone neutral, "how quickly one adjusts to restored circumstances. I trust the hall has not caused any inconvenience." "Only the inconvenience of admiration," Purbright replied, allowing his voice to carry the slightest, driest trace of humour. Around them, conversation meandered with the gentle meanness of small-town critique. There were remarks about who had contributed to the refurbishment, subtle comparisons of dress and demeanour, and occasional, delicately veiled inquiries regarding Mrs. Darnley's late husband. No one spoke ill outright, but each phrase carried the weight of polite curiosity, revealing as much about the speaker as the subject. Father Llewellyn listened with measured attentiveness. Occasionally, he allowed a question to escape, a casual inquiry regarding the parish accounts, the organisation of committees, or the method of allocating donations. Each question, simple as it appeared, seemed designed to elicit both factual response and subtle reaction. Purbright observed the committee members shift, their measured smiles not quite concealing flickers of discomfort. A single note arrived at the table, unobserved by all but Purbright. It was folded in an unusual fashion and bore only a brief, enigmatic line, "Not all is as it seems." He made no comment, tucking it discreetly into his pocket, though he could not suppress a small sense of intrigue. The widow's eyes lingered on him briefly, a flicker of acknowledgment passing between them, quickly masked by gentle conversation. The morning progressed with the polite rhythm of civil exchange. Mrs. Darnley offered commentary on upcoming charitable events, the parish committee responded with tact, and Father Llewellyn maintained his position of courteous neutrality. The villagers moved in and out of the hall, each gesture a tacit negotiation of propriety. In the corner, a small group whispered in tones measured for discretion, exchanging glances and brief, almost imperceptible notes. Purbright catalogued them silently, the pattern of minor alliances, the fissures beneath veneer, and the subtle anxiety over reputation and judgment. By midday, the hall hummed with quiet accomplishment. Tea had been served and refilled, biscuits thoughtfully replaced, and conversation lingered over trifles that upon closer examination revealed far more than they ostensibly discussed. Purbright stepped back, observing the tableau with the detached satisfaction of a man accustomed to reading beneath surface appearances. As he prepared to take leave, Mrs. Darnley approached him, teacup in hand. Her tone was gentle, measured, and faintly insistent. "Inspector, will you join me for a brief discussion tomorrow? There are matters of parish concern which I believe may benefit from your perspective." Purbright inclined his head, a quiet acknowledgment. He detected no urgency in her words, yet the invitation carried the subtle weight of expectation, the promise of minor revelation. he accepted, knowing that in Wetherby St. Clair, even the most routine of appointments could expose layers of delicacy, deception, and undisclosed sentiment. As he stepped into the mist-laden lanes, the village seemed unchanged, serene, almost inert. Yet Purbright, observing the careful positioning of shadows across windows and the slight tilt of shutters against the morning sun, understood that nothing in Wetherby St. Clair was quite as it appeared. The wandering priest's discreet attention, the committee's measured composure, and the widow's subtle command of circumstance had created a tableau of silent intrigue. In his pocket, the note whispered possibilities he could not yet name. And somewhere behind a curtained window, a pair of eyes followed him with the quiet, polite interest of someone who might yet reveal all, or conceal more than ever. It was a beginning, but Purbright understood. In a village governed by civility, reputations were both weapons and shields, and he, as always, would be the man to observe both, cataloguing every whisper, every glance, every polite smile that carried beneath it the pulse of suspicion. The morning light fell softly over Wetherby St. Clair, unremarkable in its clarity, yet revealing in the minutiae it illuminated. Inspector Purbright arrived at Mrs. Darnley's residence by way of the narrow, winding lane that led past the parish green, taking note of the subtle signs of habitation, a carefully mended fence here, a trimmed hedge there, and the faintly worn path where villagers' shoes had pressed into the earth over decades. The widow herself awaited him at the door, a figure of serene composure, her hat tilted with meticulous precision, and her gloved hands clasped lightly at her waist. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "I trust you found the parish hall satisfactory yesterday?" "Indeed, madam," Purbright replied, "a fine restoration, though I confess I suspect the committee may have enjoyed the attention more than the refurbishment itself." His words carried a dry, almost imperceptible humour, which Mrs. Darnley received with a faint tilt of her lips, neither entirely approving nor disapproving. She led him into the drawing-room, a space arranged with the deliberate exactness of someone who understood both hospitality and observation. Chairs were positioned to encourage conversation yet allow scrutiny. Small ornaments were placed to invite notice without ostentation, and the faint scent of lavender suggested propriety rather than comfort. Tea awaited them on a silver tray, accompanied by biscuits that seemed too perfect for casual consumption. Purbright noted each detail with quiet attention, cataloguing the subtle cues that often betrayed the intentions of Wetherby St. Clair's inhabitants. "Please sit, Inspector," she said, gesturing toward a pair of high-backed chairs. "I hoped we might discuss certain parish matters in a more private manner." Purbright seated himself, keeping his expression neutral, his mind already cataloguing the possibilities of what matters might entail. The widow poured the tea herself, her motions precise, her eyes, for the briefest moment, flitting to the small stack of letters on a side table. She did not comment, yet Purbright noticed the slight tension in her posture, as though the letters were both a shield and a sword. Conversation began with the expected pleasantries, remarks on the weather, inquiries about acquaintances and careful observations on village routine. All was courteous, meticulously measured, and entirely predictable. Yet beneath the surface, the dialogue carried the subtle charge of reputational scrutiny. Each phrase seemed chosen not only for its literal meaning, but also for its capacity to gauge reaction, to hint at knowledge, or to probe boundaries. Father Llewellyn mentioned, quite casually, that certain donations had arrived unusually early this year, Mrs. Darnley said. "I trust the committee did not find this inconvenient?" Purbright allowed a faint smile. Early contributions seldom inconvenienced the truly well-intentioned, though they may provoke reflection on those less enthusiastic. His tone was carefully balanced, critical without accusation, humorous without levity. Mrs. Darnley inclined her head slightly, and for a moment Purbright noted a flicker of something more than civility, recognition perhaps, or mild concern. Their eyes met, and she quickly masked the expression with a polite remark on the design of his overcoat. It was a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgment, yet in Weatherby St. Clair such subtleties could carry as much weight as overt statements. As the conversation meandered, Purbright's attention shifted to the letters. The stack was modest, yet each envelope bore a peculiar weight of intent. One, with a seal faintly disturbed, suggested recent handling. Another, written in a meticulous hand, hinted at urgency masked by civility. It was the sort of correspondence that quietly shaped behaviour. A note slipped under a door, a message delivered by hand, or an unremarkable envelope left on a table. Such instruments of influence were the unseen threads that connected the village's polite facades. Mrs. Darnley, it seemed, was acutely aware of their potential. Her hands rested near the stack, yet she made no move to touch them, as though the very act of interference might signal impropriety or weakness. Purbright's curiosity deepened. Letters in Weatherby St. Clair rarely contained anything as dramatic as scandal. More often, they contained revelation in the form of implication, suggestion, or selective memory. After several moments of measured silence, she spoke again. "I trust you have found Father Llewellyn agreeable. His inquiries are persistent, though I believe his intentions are proper." Purbright considered the statement. "He is polite," he said carefully, "though one detects an inclination toward observation, not improper, merely attentive." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Mrs. Darnley's lips. "Attentive, yes. It is remarkable how attentiveness can make one reconsider even the smallest matters." Her words were delicate, yet they carried a quiet warning. The implication was clear. In Weatherby St. Clair, attentiveness could unearth truths that polite silence would prefer remain buried. Their conversation moved, inevitably, to the topic of parish affairs, committees, contributions, and the delicate balance between influence and expectation. Every remark was framed to preserve propriety, yet each carried the subtle charge of evaluation. Purbright noted the careful dance of acknowledgement and omission, as each phrase revealed both knowledge and discretion. A single, seemingly trivial remark about a proposed charity event hinted at old disputes, and he observed how Mrs. Darnley's gentle corrections served not merely to clarify, but to assert quiet control over the narrative. It was during a discussion of the parish newsletter that Purbright perceived a faint but tangible shift. Mrs. Darnley referred with understated precision to a passage she had noted as ambiguous. The term was chosen not for its literal meaning, but for the subtle insinuation it carried. Ambiguity, she implied, could foster misrepresentation, even when intentions were innocent. Purbright noted the careful, almost imperceptible tightening of her lips, the brief pause in her otherwise steady voice. Small actions, he knew, often revealed more than the most elaborate declarations. Tea progressed with the expected civility, each sip measured, each biscuit selection deliberate. The widow's conversation included minor references to the parish committee's discussions on hall maintenance, subtly shifting focus to matters that might otherwise appear trivial. Yet in each mention Purbright discerned the faintest traces of unease, the kind that arose when individuals suspected that civility might conceal more than it revealed. As they rose to depart, Mrs. Darnley touched upon a matter of purely administrative concern, the placement of a new donation box in the hall. Yet even this seemingly mundane topic carried undercurrents of scrutiny. Purbright noted the slight hesitation in her phrasing, the almost imperceptible glance toward the letters, and the measured, deliberate inflection in her voice. These were the signals of someone deeply aware of social optics, aware that even minor decisions could produce ripples in a village where reputation was both currency and weapon. He left the house with a quiet sense of unease, wrapped in polite observation. The lane outside was calm, as if the village itself were unaware of the subtle tensions threading through its households. Yet Purbright, experienced in matters of understated intrigue, recognized the signs. Minor adjustments in behavior, careful timing of letters, and the precise selection of words were all evidence that something beneath the village's tranquil surface had shifted. By the time he returned to his lodgings, he had catalogued a series of faint yet significant observations. The widow's careful management of perception, Father Llewellyn's quietly probing attention, and the persistent, almost imperceptible circulation of letters that carried both instruction and suggestion. Each element was minor in isolation, yet together they formed a lattice of quiet intrigue as delicate as it was persistent. Late that evening, Purbright reviewed the notes he had made. One envelope, now remembered more clearly, bore a slight smudge on the seal, as though handled in haste or with some intentional misdirection. He recalled the widow's reaction, a subtle tightening of the jaw, the briefest hesitation before she resumed her composure. Nothing explicit had been said, yet the interaction carried the weight of a question left unanswered, a signal perhaps unnoticed by anyone less attuned to social nuance. He placed the envelope atop the stack of his observations, alongside other minor clues. An unfinished cup of tea at the committee meeting, the precise positioning of chairs at Mrs. Darnley's drawing-room, and the faint, lingering glance of Father Llewellyn toward a letter that had not been discussed aloud. Each element, trivial in isolation, suggested that Weatherby St. Clair had secrets it preferred to disguise with civility, and that the arrival of the wandering priest had subtly altered the balance of observation and discretion. Purbright leaned back in his chair and allowed himself the faintest smile, one of professional appreciation rather than humour. In Weatherby St. Clair, reputations were managed as delicately as any financial ledger, and moral transgressions were almost always measured in whispers rather than actions. The inspector knew that the village's equilibrium was fragile, held together by polite silence, social expectation, and a careful avoidance of overt scrutiny. Yet he had seen enough to understand that even in such a community, one misplaced glance, one ambiguous letter, could initiate consequences unforeseen by those who believed themselves most secure. As the candle burned low, Purbright's thoughts returned to the envelope, the smudged seal, and the widow's careful composure. The day had revealed nothing overt, no scandal, no confrontation, no dramatic transgression. And yet, in the delicate interplay of observation and omission, the inspector sensed the faintest tremor of disturbance. A question lingered quietly. Whose hand had so recently touched the letter, and to what end? He resolved silently that tomorrow's visit to the parish hall would be conducted with both patience and scrutiny. For in Weatherby St. Clair the smallest behaviours carried weight, and the gentlest suspicions often led to revelations no one else might anticipate. In the measured calm of his lodgings, Purbright felt the subtle thrill of anticipation that came from understanding the silent currents beneath polite society, a thrill that required neither drama nor spectacle, only the patient observation of human character in its most restrained and revealing form. And so the day ended, not with a confrontation, but with a question, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the balance of civility, and a clue that, while seemingly minor, promised that the unravelling of perception and propriety had only just begun. The parish committee convened in the hall with the sort of decorum that suggested both duty and self-preservation. The room, freshly polished after the recent refurbishment, exuded a faint scent of wax and old timber, a combination that might have been pleasant, if not for the underlying tension carried by its occupants. Inspector Purbright arrived punctually, noting at once the carefully arranged seating, a ring of authority and subtle surveillance, wherein each member could observe and judge the others while maintaining the impression of collegiality. "Good morning, Inspector," said Mr. Collingwood, a committee elder, whose every nod seemed weighed with history and propriety. "We are, as always, grateful for your presence. It adds assurance." His voice carried the bland politeness of one who means, simultaneously, to commend and to evaluate. Purbright inclined his head. "I am pleased to assist, though I fear my contributions will be measured in observation rather than edict." The dry humour, faint as it was, drew only a subtle twitch from Collingwood's lips. Such small acknowledgments, Purbright knew, were often the most telling. Mrs. Darnley entered quietly, her presence subtly altering the dynamic. She did not speak immediately, but her eyes roamed the assembly, noting the slight lean of each figure, the fractionally elevated chin of those attempting to assert subtle dominance, and the occasional twitch of a hand betraying restrained impatience. Purbright observed in silence. In Wetherby St. Clair, civility was the language of concealment, and the widow spoke fluently without uttering a word. The meeting commenced with the formal reading of minutes, the language precise and impeccably neutral. "The committee acknowledges the completion of hall repairs," intoned Mr. Henshaw the vicar, "and the timely contributions from all benefactors." At each mention of a donation, eyes flickered toward Mrs. Darnley, and she returned the glances with measured acknowledgment. There was civility, certainly, yet it was the kind that carried undercurrents of subtle envy and quiet judgment. Discussion of upcoming events followed, with particular attention to allocation of charitable funds. Each suggestion, framed as necessity, was delivered with an air of impartiality that masked deeply personal interests. Mr. Faraday, who oversaw the annual bazaar, insisted politely on a slight adjustment of the budget. His phrasing, deferential, almost obsequious, suggested a desire both to influence and to conceal that influence. Purbright, noting the small but telling flicker in Mrs. Darnley's eyes, recorded it silently in his mind. Father Llewellyn, seated near the window with the faintest inclination of formality, observed and occasionally inquired. His questions were indirect, carefully phrased to appear neutral, yet his timing and choice of topic revealed a subtle effort to uncover motivations rather than facts. "Might it not be prudent," he suggested, "to consider the potential responses of those who do not, as yet, contribute to our efforts?" The words were polite, the effect was precise. Heads tilted, hands tightened subtly around papers, and the faintest blush of discomfort crossed a few cheeks. Purbright noted the small shifts. No one spoke openly, yet each man or woman had registered the challenge to their moral and social positioning. A minor disagreement arose over hall decoration, a subject that on the surface appeared trivial. The selection of curtains, pattern, hue and material became a matter of delicate negotiation. Mrs. Darnley proposed a design that was tasteful, yet subtly assertive. Mr. Collingwood suggested an alternative, citing tradition, and the discussion unfolded with the slow rhythm of polite debate, each sentence weighted with careful civility. Purbright observed not the words themselves, but the spaces between them. The pauses, the suppressed sighs, the faint raising of eyebrows, all spoke volumes of the unspoken social calculus. Here, in a matter as mundane as curtain choice, lay the village's hierarchy and the subtle jockeying for reputational advantage. The widow's calm persistence eventually settled the matter, not with triumph, but with the gentle assertion of authority disguised as concession. Amid the discussion, a note appeared, passed discreetly across the table. It bore no signature, only the single line, "One ought to be mindful of appearances." Its presence elicited subtle reactions, a tightened grip on the agenda, a faintly startled glance toward the widow, and a momentary shift in Father Llewellyn's posture. Purbright's eyes lingered on the note without comment. It was precisely the sort of instrument by which civility was tested and suspicion quietly sown. The meeting moved to correspondence, each letter handled with meticulous care. A small stack of envelopes prompted furtive exchanges of glance, a polite cough, and the faintest clearing of throats, all intended to maintain an air of ordinary business. Purbright noticed one letter, cream-coloured and partially opened, resting beside Mrs. Darnley. Her hands hovered near it, yet she did not disturb the contents. The gesture, minute though it was, carried the quiet assertion that she was both guardian and observer of propriety. Father Llewellyn's presence continued to serve as a subtle accelerant. He posed questions of neutrality, the distribution of tasks, the accountability of funds, the timing of announcements, yet each query, carefully structured, drew revealing responses, small, involuntary reactions that betrayed priorities and alliances. Purbright catalogued them silently, a faint hesitation, a carefully adjusted tie, a subtle shift in seating. Each was evidence of the intricate web of social perception and moral calculation that governed the village. Discussion eventually returned to the matter of parish contributions. A disagreement arose between Mr. Faraday and Miss Trelawney regarding the sequencing of collection drives. Words were chosen with meticulous caution, each phrase framed to minimize offense while maximizing subtle influence. Purbright observed the micro-gestures. Miss Trelawney's lips pressed slightly, Mr. Faraday's hand hovering over the ledger as if to assert tentative authority, and Mrs. Darnley's serene gaze, which seemed to measure, weigh, and adjudicate without speaking. When the meeting drew to a close, each member rose with practiced poise, shaking hands in a pattern of decorum and recognition. No overt confrontation had occurred, yet the air was charged with nuanced observation, unspoken judgment, and silent reprisal. Purbright noted that the committee's outward harmony masked a lattice of undercurrents: jealousy, ambition, guilt, and the faintest tremor of concealed scandal. The village's social machinery, though polished, was not immune to friction. On his way out, Purbright lingered near the window, observing the committee as they departed. A small exchange caught his attention, a barely perceptible tightening of Mr. Collingwood's jaw, a quick glance between Miss Trelawney and another member, and the subtle lift of a hand toward the cream-coloured letter. None of these gestures were dramatic, none required verbal confirmation, yet together they formed a constellation of behaviour that hinted at concealed concern. Once outside, Purbright reflected on the morning. The committee had achieved its stated goals: discussion completed, decisions recorded, appearances maintained. Yet beneath the surface, the intricate balance of Weatherby Sinclair's social hierarchy had been tested. Letters, gestures, and indirect queries had exposed the vulnerabilities of reputation and the quiet anxieties of those who wished both to appear virtuous and to remain unexamined. A final observation lingered in Purbright's mind. As Mrs. Darnley walked along the lane beside him, she allowed her eyes to rest, almost imperceptibly, on the parish hall, her expression serene yet faintly guarded. It was the sort of look that carried meaning only to those attuned to subtle signals, a recognition that appearances were fragile, and that perhaps someone within the committee had begun to sense the precariousness of their positions. He filed these thoughts quietly, aware that the day's interactions had left a subtle residue of information, a minor note, an ambiguous glance, and the carefully managed comportment of individuals who understood that civility was both protection and constraint. Even the smallest gestures could carry significance, and the inspector had learned to observe them with patience and precision. As the light softened in the late afternoon, Purbright considered the cream-coloured envelope once more. Though it had remained unopened before him, its mere presence had already influenced behaviour. Who had passed it? Who had received it? And, most importantly, what intentions, benevolent, malicious or ambiguous, did it carry? The answers, he suspected, would not reveal themselves in dramatic fashion, but in the gradual alignment of small gestures, subtle admissions, and careful, almost imperceptible shifts in posture and tone. The day concluded not with revelation, but with the faintest suggestion that the equilibrium of Wetherby St. Clair had been disturbed. The committee members departed under a guise of civility, yet beneath the smiles and courteous bows a network of quiet anxieties had begun to stir. Purbright remained behind, cataloguing these currents, noting the weight of unspoken observation and appreciating the delicate interplay of morality, reputation, and social expectation. The chapter ended with the smallest of clues, a hand brushing, unintentionally perhaps, against the edge of the cream-coloured letter as a member passed the hall door. The gesture was slight, nearly invisible, but for Purbright it was sufficient, a silent question, a hint of acknowledgement, and a subtle prompt that the first true ripples of intrigue were taking shape within the polished veneer of village civility. The day was unusually still, with the low sun glinting off the windows of Wetherby St. Clair in a manner that highlighted both the charm and the minor imperfections of its stone cottages. Inspector Purbright approached his lodgings with the faint satisfaction of a man who has catalogued small, telling behaviours and yet senses that the greater tableau has barely begun to reveal itself. There was a letter waiting for him, deposited with quiet discretion beneath the door. Its envelope bore no signature, only a neatly written line in careful, precise script. Observe without presumption. Some things are best uncovered gradually. Purbright regarded the missive with the mildest arch of his brow, noting the absence of urgency. The handwriting was deliberate, refined, yet anonymous, and its purpose, he suspected, was not to alarm, but to hint. He filed it carefully among his notes, aware that in Wetherby St. Clair the act of sending a letter could carry as much meaning as the contents themselves. Whoever had placed it wished their presence known, yet without confrontation, an observation as subtle as the village's most understated gossip. Later that morning he visited the parish hall under the guise of routine inspection. The hall appeared immaculate, its freshly varnished floor gleaming under the mild sunlight filtering through tall windows. Yet it was not the polish that drew Purbright's attention, but the small inconsistencies. A smudge at the edge of a windowsill, a chair slightly askew, and the faint trace of recent footsteps that did not match the pattern of ordinary committee use. Each minor detail suggested a careful visitor, someone accustomed to moving through space with purpose and discretion. Father Llewellyn was already present, standing near the corner where the morning light fell across the wooden floor. He acknowledged Purbright with a subtle nod, his hands folded in quiet consideration. "Inspector," he said, his tone measured, "it appears the hall is well cared for, though certain arrangements invite reflection." Purbright inclined his head. "Observations of alignment and use are rarely neutral, Father. They speak more of those who occupy space than of the space itself." The priest's gaze lingered on the empty chairs and tables, and Purbright, with his habitual attention to nuance, noted a faint tension in the priest's posture. Llewellyn's politeness concealed more than it revealed, and the inspector understood that this quiet attentiveness was itself a kind of inquiry. one conducted without words, relying on gesture, pause, and the subtle vibration of observation. The committee arrived shortly thereafter, each member engaging in their accustomed dance of civility. Mr. Collingwood greeted the priest with a careful handclasp, his eyes momentarily darting toward the ledger that lay upon the central table. Miss Trelawney entered next, her expression composed, yet subtly apprehensive, as if aware that even the most neutral of gestures might be interpreted. The widow, arriving last, moved with serene precision, a figure both observer and guardian, her gaze sweeping across the assembly with quiet authority. Discussion began with minor administrative matters, a review of donations, the scheduling of upcoming events, and the meticulous accounting of parish expenditures. Each item was treated with formal attention, and yet Purbright noted how comments were often framed to convey judgment while maintaining civility. A query regarding the placement of charitable envelopes prompted a flurry of careful expressions, subtle shifts in posture, and exchanges of glances that spoke volumes in the silence between words. "It may be prudent," Mrs. Darnley said, her tone gentle yet precise, "to ensure that the donations reach the intended recipients without unintended exposure. Visibility is admirable, but discretion often achieves more." Her hands rested lightly upon the ledger, and the faint tightening of her lips suggested that she anticipated challenge or objection. Miss Trelawney responded with the polite hesitation characteristic of someone who wishes to contribute while remaining within the bounds of propriety. "Certainly, madam, though one might also consider that too much discretion risks obscuring generosity from public appreciation." The widow allowed the comment to pass without overt acknowledgement, yet Purbright detected the briefest tightening of her jaw, a signal as subtle as a whisper in the wind. Such minor gestures, he reflected, often carried the weight of revelation. Father Llewellyn interjected, carefully measured, "Perhaps a balance may be struck, one that allows for both recognition and preservation of reputational integrity." His words were courteous, yet the implication was clear. He observed, he questioned, and he anticipated responses without accusation. The conversation shifted toward correspondence, and the stack of letters on the table became an instrument of quiet tension. Purbright noted the order of presentation, the careful handling, and the slight hesitation with which one envelope was passed from Miss Trelawney to Mr. Collingwood. The act was innocuous in appearance, yet its very subtlety suggested that the content carried implications not to be spoken aloud. Even in a town such as Wetherby St. Clair, the circulation of a single note could influence behaviour, provoke reflection, and unsettle carefully maintained reputations. As the committee discussed allocations, a minor disagreement arose, ostensibly over the sequence of donation deliveries. Each objection was phrased in the language of civility, yet beneath the words lurked a quiet assertion of moral authority and social hierarchy. Purbright observed that those who spoke least often wielded the most influence, relying upon the reactions of others rather than their own assertions. Mrs. Darnley, while silent, exerted a gravitational pull on the conversation. The subtle deference or discomfort she provoked revealed as much about the other members as any overt statement could. During a pause in discussion, a faint rustling at the far corner of the room drew Purbright's attention. A small envelope had shifted slightly, apparently unnoticed, atop the ledger. He noted it discreetly, no name, no seal, merely a subtle disruption in the orderly arrangement of correspondence. Such anomalies were often the first indicators of deliberate influence, an almost imperceptible attempt to redirect attention or provoke inquiry. Tea was eventually served in the hall, a ritual performed with meticulous care. Cups were placed precisely, biscuits aligned with careful symmetry, and the priest's movements reflected his habitual courtesy. Conversation drifted to parish events, the selection of speakers, and the scheduling of rehearsals. Each topic was presented with civility, yet under the surface, small hierarchies and alliances were revealed in gestures, pauses, and the inflection of voices. Purbright observed the interactions with his customary attention. Mr. Collingwood's hand brushed the edge of the cream-coloured envelope more than once, each touch fleeting yet telling. Miss Trelawney's gaze flicked toward it, then away, as if to avoid acknowledgement. Even Father Llewellyn, despite his composed demeanour, allowed his attention to linger, registering responses with quiet precision. The envelope, trivial in itself, had become a pivot around which subtle power dynamics revolved. As the meeting drew toward conclusion, Mrs. Darnley made a brief, understated suggestion regarding the publication of a notice in the parish newsletter. Her phrasing was indirect, courteous, yet carried the weight of expectation. The suggestion was likely to be accepted, though none would state so openly. Purbright recognized the elegance of her influence. She shaped outcomes not through argument but through carefully timed implication, a gentle pressure upon the consciousness of others. When the committee members departed, the hall resumed its tranquil appearance, yet Purbright, noting minor disturbances, the slightly displaced envelope, a smudge on the floor, and the faint impressions of footsteps, understood that beneath the veneer of civility, currents of suspicion and anticipation had shifted. The behaviour of the committee, Father Llewellyn, and the widow had subtly altered in response to the circulation of letters, the timing of inquiries, and the unspoken hierarchy of influence. Walking back along the narrow lane, Purbright considered the day's observations. No overt conflict had occurred, no dramatic revelation had been made, yet the village had spoken in the quiet language of gesture, hesitation, and carefully controlled attention. The cream-coloured envelope, the subtle adjustments of seating, and the weight of civility had revealed fractures, however minor, in the communal facade. At his lodgings he set the envelope aside and made notes in the careful script he reserved for the cataloguing of nuance. Who had handled it? With what purpose? And why had it been allowed to rest, unnoticed, by most, in the precise location where it would elicit small, telling gestures? These were questions he filed mentally, knowing that in Wetherby St. Clair such questions often produced answers not in dramatic disclosure, but in the gradual alignment of observation, motive, and social expectation. The day concluded not with revelation, but with the faintest suggestion that the balance of civility had been altered. A subtle tension persisted, almost invisible, yet palpable to the trained observer, a shift in posture here, a lingering glance there, and the quiet acknowledgement that reputations, though carefully maintained, were delicate and susceptible to perturbation. And in the evening light, as Purbright catalogued each detail and allowed his mind to trace the interlocking subtleties of behaviour, he noticed one final, almost imperceptible clue. A smudge upon the envelope, faint yet deliberate enough to indicate recent handling. It was neither dramatic nor accusatory, merely a mark that suggested intention, perhaps innocent, perhaps otherwise. A silent question hung over the observation. Who had moved the letter, and with what quiet purpose? In Wetherby St. Clair, he knew, even such a small action could shift perception, unsettle the polite equilibrium, and initiate a sequence of subtle consequences. The inspector leaned back, the faintest smile touching his lips, appreciating once more the elegant mechanics of civility, suspicion, and unspoken influence, and the gentle, inexorable unravelling of a village's hidden narratives. The village of Wetherby St. Clair was unusually quiet that morning, the air bearing only the faintest hint of smoke from chimneys and the subtle odour of damp stone. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish hall, noting the carefully trimmed hedges and the slight scattering of leaves along the path. Such minor irregularities were often unremarkable to the casual observer, yet he understood that in a village where civility was the currency of interaction, even the smallest deviations could signal attention, absence, or deliberate manipulation. Mrs. Darnley awaited him at the hall entrance, her posture impeccable, her gloved hands clasped lightly in front. She inclined her head in greeting with the precision of someone accustomed to observing reactions, her eyes assessing Purbright in a manner both courteous and subtly evaluative. "Inspector," she said, "I am grateful for your punctuality. There are matters that require, if I may say, careful consideration." Purbright inclined his head slightly. "I should imagine such matters benefit from quiet observation more than overt discussion, madam." His words, tempered with the faintest trace of wryness, seemed to amuse her without fully disclosing approval. The committee members arrived shortly thereafter, entering with the careful choreography of individuals who understood the weight of appearances. Mr. Collingwood led the way, hands folded behind his back, eyes flicking toward the envelope that lay conspicuously atop the ledger. Miss Trelawney followed, her expression composed but measured, suggesting awareness of observation and the implicit social hierarchies at play. Father Llewellyn appeared last, his gaze calm and measured, though Purbright noted a slight furrow in his brow as he scanned the assembly, as though calculating the dynamics of influence and expectation. Discussion commenced, ostensibly concerning the routine matters of parish administration, scheduling of events, allocation of donations, and the minutiae of correspondence. Yet beneath the surface, the interplay of authority and restraint was already manifest. Each phrase was chosen with care, balancing politeness against assertion, civility against subtle assertion of dominance. The widow's presence, serene and unobtrusive, nevertheless guided the conversation with the gentle force of propriety. A minor disagreement arose regarding the timing of the upcoming charity collection. Mr. Faraday, whose meticulous nature was well known, proposed an early start, citing efficiency. Miss Trelawney, however, argued for a more measured approach, invoking tradition and the comfort of long-standing expectations. Their exchange was courteous yet taut, each word weighted with both implication and politeness. "It is, of course, a matter of some discretion," Mrs. Darnley interposed gently, her voice smooth and controlled. "While efficiency is admirable, one must also consider the impressions made upon contributors and recipients alike." Her hands rested lightly upon the ledger, and her eyes, though calm, registered the briefest glimmer of calculation. She offered no further guidance, leaving the choice of course to the subtle pressure of expectation rather than direct instruction. Father Llewellyn's interjection was deliberate, phrased to appear casual. "Might it not also be wise to consider those who have yet to contribute? Their perceptions may be as significant as the contributions themselves." The statement, polite and indirect, carried the effect of probing for underlying motives. Several members shifted slightly in their chairs, the faintest tension threading the otherwise smooth veneer of civility. As the meeting progressed, Purbright's attention wandered to the letters laid carefully upon the central table. One, cream-coloured and unsealed, had moved slightly as though recently handled. The subtle displacement prompted a tiny flinch from Mr. Collingwood when his gaze fell upon it, and a brief glance from Miss Trelawney, which she quickly masked with polite interest in the minutes. Purbright noted these micro-reactions with quiet satisfaction. In Wetherby St. Clair, the smallest behavioural shift often revealed more than any overt argument could. Discussion of a minor logistical issue, the arrangement of chairs for the upcoming recital, took a curious turn. Mr. Collingwood expressed concern that a certain group of villagers, recently reconciled with the parish after minor disagreement, might be seated too prominently. Miss Trelawney, equally measured, suggested that such placement could foster goodwill and demonstrate the parish's impartiality. The exchange, ostensibly trivial, was fraught with understated signalling. Each participant gauged the reactions of others, careful to maintain civility while testing boundaries. Mrs. Darnley observed silently, allowing the dialogue to unfold. When she finally spoke, it was to suggest a compromise phrased entirely in the language of decorum. Perhaps a central placement for the reconciled members, accompanied by subtle acknowledgement of their continued participation, would satisfy both efficiency and propriety. Her voice carried no imperiousness, yet the subtle gravitas of her statement prompted nods of agreement. Even the previously resistant Mr. Collingwood assented with the faintest sigh, as though relieved that civility had been preserved. The cream-coloured envelope, however, remained a quiet presence at the centre of the table, its potential significance unspoken but palpably felt. Purbright noted the way members' hands hovered near it, then withdrew, the gesture so slight that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone untrained in the subtlety of social observation. The envelope was, in a sense, an unacknowledged participant in the proceedings, an object capable of shaping behaviour, provoking thought, and eliciting micro-reactions without a single word spoken. Tea was eventually brought to the hall, served with the customary precision, each cup placed exactly as decorum dictated. Conversation shifted to minor anecdotal matters, the growth of hedges, the repair of fences, and the punctuality of deliveries. Though mundane in content, the exchanges provided ample opportunity for observation. Purbright noted the slight hesitation in Mr. Faraday's responses, the carefully modulated tones of Miss Trelawney, and Father Llewellyn's intermittent glances toward the ledger. At one point, a small comment from Father Llewellyn drew a ripple through the committee. "One wonders," he said, tone light yet precise, "if all contributions are as willingly given as they appear, or whether obligation may sometimes guide generosity." No one responded verbally, yet the subtle adjustment of seating, the brief tightening of hands around teacups, and the faint clearing of throats spoke volumes. In Wetherby St. Clair, even rhetorical questions could function as quiet instruments of revelation. Purbright, quietly observing, allowed a faint smile. The day's unfolding confirmed his long-held understanding. The village's social equilibrium relied upon careful orchestration, restrained expression, and the delicate interplay of observation and implication. No dramatic scandal had emerged, yet beneath the surface subtle anxieties had been stoked and reputations tested without recourse to confrontation. When the meeting adjourned, members departed with the practiced civility characteristic of the village. Mrs. Darnley's final glance at the cream-coloured envelope, coupled with the faintest contraction of her lips, suggested awareness of both its movement and its latent significance. Purbright noted the gesture silently, cataloguing it as he would any other behavioural data point. The envelope had been touched once more by a hand that might not have intended observation, but whose mere contact sent ripples across the network of expectation. Walking back toward his lodgings, Purbright reflected on the day's events. The envelope, minor though it seemed, had altered behaviour in multiple directions. Hesitation, subtle inquiry, and an almost imperceptible assertion of awareness. The committee members had left the hall without overt discord, yet their movements, glances, and tones carried traces of reflection, apprehension, and cautious calculation. Such indicators, the inspector knew, were often the prelude to more substantive revelation. Later, seated in his lodgings with the faint glow of the late afternoon sun falling across his notes, Purbright considered the pattern emerging from the preceding days. The widow's calm authority, Father Llewellyn's measured attentiveness, the committee's quiet deference, and the circulation of letters, these elements formed a lattice of influence, subtle yet persistent. In Wetherby St. Clair, Social power was exercised not in public pronouncement but in quiet suggestion, in the careful management of appearance and perception. He returned to the envelope one final time, noting the smudge along its edge and the subtle displacement from its original position. It was a minor clue, easily overlooked by anyone lacking attentiveness. Yet for Purbright, it was enough, a silent question, a small indication that someone had interacted with it, and that this interaction might carry consequences unanticipated by its handler. In a village governed by civility, such gestures often produced outcomes as significant as overt declarations. The day concluded without spectacle, without confrontation, without revelation. And yet, as Purbright catalogued the sequence of observations, he discerned a faint shift in the village's equilibrium. A gesture here, a glance there, a hand brushing against an envelope. All minor, almost imperceptible, yet pregnant with the potential for consequence. The cream-coloured envelope, though still sealed, had already begun to assert its quiet influence. A single, almost imperceptible clue remained. The slight smudge, the subtle repositioning, and the faintly altered posture of a committee member as they left the hall. It was a signal of attention, a suggestion of awareness, and a question unanswered. Purbright, with his characteristic patience, recognized it as an invitation to continued observation, a subtle prompt that the careful balance of civility, reputation, and suspicion in Wetherby St. Clair was already in motion toward its inevitable revelations. The morning fog lingered low over Wetherby St. Clair, curling along the lanes and lingering against the stone walls of the cottages with the persistent patience of a small town secret. Inspector Purbright walked the familiar route toward the parish hall, noting the understated precision with which Mrs. Darnley had arranged the flowers in the doorway, the petals facing outward in careful symmetry. Such attention to detail was never accidental in this village. It was a quiet declaration of order, a reminder that propriety was observed even in the smallest of gestures. Upon entering, Purbright observed Father Llewellyn already present, standing near the notice board and examining the postings with deliberate attention. His expression was composed, though a faint tension in the tightening of his lips suggested scrutiny beyond mere inspection. "Good morning, Inspector," he said, inclining his head. "The day appears calm, though I suspect appearances may not be entirely truthful." His tone was light, yet the implication, subtle, almost mischievous, was unmistakable. Mrs. Darnley arrived moments later, gloved hands clasped in their customary poise, her gaze sweeping the hall as if conducting a silent audit. "Inspector, Father, I hope you will find the morning suitable for discussion," she said, her voice carefully neutral, yet tinged with the faintest suggestion of anticipation. "There are minor concerns, though nothing overt." The words, courteous as they were, carried an almost imperceptible charge. She expected attention to subtlety, the recognition of implication without need for exposition. The parish committee assembled soon after, each member moving with the practiced courtesy of those who understood that civility, in Wetherby St. Clair, was both armour and instrument. Mr. Collingwood, hands behind his back, allowed his eyes to linger briefly on the cream-coloured envelope still resting upon the ledger. Miss Trelawney entered with measured pace, offering nods that were polite yet precise in their calculation. Each participant's entrance was a performance, carefully constructed, yet revealing small cracks in composure and attention that only the observant could detect. The meeting commenced with the review of correspondence, ostensibly routine, yet laden with nuance. A letter had arrived overnight, its handwriting unfamiliar yet deliberate, and was placed carefully upon the table without commentary. Purbright noted the subtle reactions. Mr. Collingwood's brief hesitation in picking up his pen, Miss Trelawney's careful adjustment of her seating, and Mrs. Darnley's faint, almost imperceptible contraction of the jaw. The envelope, though seemingly trivial, functioned as a catalyst, prompting subconscious responses to perceived obligation, secrecy, and propriety. Father Llewellyn's voice entered the conversation with measured neutrality. "One might consider," he observed, "that the timing of correspondence is itself instructive. To whom it is directed, when it is received, and the context within which it is opened, all may be more revealing than the content itself." His words were polite, even gentle, yet they caused the committee to momentarily pause, each member quietly assessing whether their own behaviour might be inadvertently transparent. Mrs. Darnley interjected, her phrasing deliberate, measured. "Indeed, Father, and it is for precisely this reason that discretion, even in minor matters, is of the utmost importance. One must attend not only to duty, but to perception." The words elegant in form carried the dual function of guidance and gentle admonition, eliciting nods of acknowledgement while leaving no space for disagreement without social discomfort. The committee proceeded to discuss the allocation of funds for the upcoming village fête. On the surface, the discourse was entirely practical: the purchase of tents, the timing of food deliveries, and the scheduling of musical performances. Yet each suggestion and counter-suggestion was laden with subtle social implications. Mr. Faraday's insistence on early set-up suggested not efficiency alone, but an assertion of control, a test of compliance from those less assertive. Miss Trelawney's gentle objections, framed in civility, were equally a statement of moral vigilance and reputational concern. Purbright, observing, catalogued each motion and glance with quiet satisfaction. The interactions, so understated, revealed a hierarchy invisible to any observer, not attuned to subtle cues. Mrs. Darnley's calm, almost imperceptible interventions served to shape outcomes, without overt direction, guiding the moral and social currents of the assembly with an elegance of control that few could contest. A minor interruption occurred when a committee member retrieved a recently received parcel from the corner of the hall. The package, wrapped in plain paper, yet bearing a small seal, elicited a near imperceptible shift in attention. Hands hovered above papers, and eyes glanced momentarily toward Mrs. Darnley and Father Llewellyn. The parcel's arrival was presented as routine, yet Purbright discerned the quiet tension it introduced. In Wetherby St. Clair, even mundane objects carried the potential for revelation. A folded note, a seal pressed incorrectly, a small smudge upon the paper. Each could provoke hesitation, suspicion, and reflection. As the discussion resumed, Father Llewellyn posed a question framed in polite neutrality. Might it be that our decisions, though seemingly objective, are guided as much by observation of precedent and perception as by practical necessity? The query, gentle yet pointed, was met with measured reflection. Purbright observed how subtle shifts, postures straightening, slight furrowing of brows, and the careful modulation of tone betrayed internal calculation. The question itself, though innocuous in wording, acted as a lens upon which hidden priorities became faintly visible. Mrs. Darnley allowed a quiet pause before responding, her voice soft yet weighted. "It is often true that what appears straightforward is never so entirely. Perception, as much as action, informs the reception of our decisions. One must weigh not only effect, but impression." Her phrasing, composed and unassertive, nevertheless carried authority. It shaped understanding without overt imposition. Tea was served mid-morning, and the ritual provided a further canvas for observation. Cups were positioned with deliberate care, biscuits aligned symmetrically, and the soft clink of porcelain punctuated measured conversation. Mr. Collingwood's hand brushed against the ledger, his fingers hesitating near the cream-coloured envelope, while Miss Trelawney's gaze followed, careful to appear casual. Even the priest's otherwise serene demeanour displayed a slight tightening of the lips, indicative of his own attentiveness. A small comment, seemingly tangential, drew ripples through the committee. Miss Trelawney mentioned, with polite neutrality, that a minor discrepancy had been noted in last year's donations. Though phrased with courtesy, the remark prompted subtle micro-reactions, a brief shifting of chairs, a tightened hand around a pen, and a slight cough. Purbright noted the efficiency with which social unease had been evoked, without need for direct confrontation. The morning's proceedings concluded with a discussion of the newsletter. Mrs. Darnley suggested phrasing a notice with precision to avoid misinterpretation. Her recommendation, carefully indirect, elicited nods and quiet agreement. Yet, Purbright noted that the cream-coloured envelope, undisturbed but present, had quietly shaped the participants' behaviour throughout, acting as an unseen observer and instigator. The smallest presence had produced disproportionately noticeable effects, a testament to the subtle mechanics of influence in Wetherby St. Clair. When the committee departed, each member executed the ritual of civility with meticulous attention. Nods, bows, and brief phrases of acknowledgement conveyed propriety, yet beneath these gestures lay undercurrents of reflection and consideration, visible only to the trained eye. Purbright lingered, observing the minute adjustments in posture and glance, cataloguing the accumulation of minor signals that together formed a tapestry of moral and social expectation. Walking back along the fog-laden lanes, he considered the patterns that had emerged. The cream-coloured envelope, the minor discrepancies, the micro-reactions, all were evidence that beneath the village's veneer of tranquillity, quiet currents of suspicion, conscience, and anticipation were in motion. Each gesture, though minor, was capable of influencing perception and altering behaviour. In a village where reputation was a subtle currency, such instruments were more potent than overt acts. Arriving at his lodgings, Purbright set aside the envelope for further consideration. The smudge upon its edge, the slight displacement on the ledger, and the tentative touches it had elicited from multiple individuals formed a silent trail of observation, social calculation, and moral hesitation. The inspector catalogued each instance with meticulous care, aware that the envelope's significance lay not in revelation, but in its ability to provoke reflection and response. As evening settled over the village, the inspector leaned back and considered a final, almost imperceptible clue, a slight wrinkle in the paper of the envelope, suggesting it had been handled not once, but perhaps twice, by someone uncertain or deliberate. The gesture was almost invisible, yet it carried meaning in the context of Wetherby St. Clair. Attention, intention, and the beginnings of subtle consequences. The day ended not with scandal, confrontation, or revelation, but with a quiet shift, the faint impression of influence, the silent acknowledgement that even trivial objects could shape behaviour, and the subtle question lingering in Purbright's mind: who had handled the envelope, and for what unspoken purpose? In the village, he understood, answers were never immediate, and the slow accumulation of observation, inference, and propriety would eventually disclose truths that direct investigation could never reveal. The village of Wetherby St. Clair seemed smaller in the mid-morning light, the fog having dissipated just enough to reveal chimneys and tiled rooftops glinting faintly with dew. Inspector Purbright walked deliberately along the narrow lanes, noting the manner in which each resident engaged in their customary routines with an almost theatrical decorum. Shopkeepers arranged wares with exacting precision, laundry hung straight and taut, and hedges, even in minor gardens, were trimmed to an imperceptible symmetry. Such details, trivial as they might appear, provided him with an early impression of the village's equilibrium, one he suspected was already, if subtly, under negotiation. Purbright arrived at the parish hall, where Father Llewellyn awaited, perusing a ledger with careful attention. "Inspector," the priest said without looking up, "it seems we are entering a period of observation rather than overt action. Yet appearances may be deceptive, as ever. He spoke with his usual mild authority, his tone suggesting knowledge that remained politely undisclosed. Purbright inclined his head. Deception in Wetherby St. Clair was rarely dramatic, but the quiet subtleties of concealment required careful discernment. Mrs. Darnley entered shortly thereafter, her gloves immaculate and hands folded, her gaze sweeping the hall in that quiet, evaluative manner that suggested she observed not only the space, but the spirits within it. "The committee will join us shortly," she said, her voice as measured as her posture. "There are minor concerns regarding communications and impressions. I hope these may be addressed with discretion." Purbright noted the deliberate understatement, a hallmark of her influence. No command issued, yet the implication was unmistakable. The committee arrived in their usual order, each member performing the ritual of civility with precision. Mr. Collingwood's steps were measured, eyes briefly flicking toward the cream-coloured envelope still resting atop the ledger, as though it contained a truth too delicate to speak aloud. Miss Trelawney followed with a gentle nod, her hands clasped in front of her, and a subtle tightening of her lips betrayed that her attention was divided between civility and concern. Father Llewellyn's gaze swept the assembly, serene yet inquisitive, noting the faint signs of micro-anxiety among the members. The meeting began with the routine review of correspondence, yet even this mundane task was infused with layered social significance. A letter had arrived overnight, small and folded, unsigned, yet deliberate in its arrival. It was placed upon the table without ceremony, yet the reactions it elicited were immediate. Mr. Collingwood hesitated over his pen, Miss Trelawney's fingers brushed her notes with the faintest tremor, and Mrs. Darnley allowed a subtle contraction of the jaw. Each movement, so slight as to be almost invisible, spoke of the village's perpetual negotiation between perception and propriety. Father Llewellyn interjected with measured neutrality. "One might observe that the timing of such communications is instructive. Not merely what is said, but the circumstances under which it is delivered can carry meaning. Consideration of this may guide our understanding of intentions." His phrasing was careful, polite, and entirely indirect, yet it prompted subtle ripples through the assembly. Heads tilted, fingers flexed, and a faint tightening of posture betrayed the thought now occupying several minds. Discretion and observation were being evaluated as surely as action. The discussion shifted toward the upcoming village fete, ostensibly concerning logistics, tables, tents, food distribution, and musical arrangements. Mr. Faraday's voice was precise, advocating early setup with the appearance of efficiency, yet Purbright noted the undertone, an assertion of influence masked as practicality. Miss Trelawney, in gentle opposition, cited tradition and the comfort of participants, asserting her own influence through the guise of consideration. Each exchange, though polite, revealed subtle rivalries and the negotiation of moral authority. Mrs. Darnley's interventions were rare but impactful, phrased with the faintest neutrality, yet carrying undeniable weight. "Perhaps a compromise may serve both efficiency and tradition," she suggested, her hands resting lightly on the ledger. "One does not wish to appear dismissive, yet the expectations of our patrons must be acknowledged." The room nodded in near unison, not in acquiescence, but in recognition of the quiet authority her words implied. A minor interruption occurred when a small envelope, previously unnoticed, shifted near the ledger. Its presence prompted micro-reactions. Mr. Collingwood's hand hovered briefly before withdrawing. Miss Trelawney's eyes flicked toward it, and Father Llewellyn, despite his serene posture, allowed a subtle tightening of his lips. The envelope was trivial in content, yet consequential in influence. It functioned as an unacknowledged observer, an agent of social reflection, shaping behavior through its quiet existence alone. Tea was served mid-morning, and the ritual offered further opportunity for observation. Cups were aligned, biscuits presented symmetrically, and the soft clink of porcelain punctuated measured conversation. Each gesture, Purbright noted, was a potential signal. Mr. Collingwood's brief pause before reaching for his cup, Miss Trelawney's careful monitoring of her own posture, the priest's intermittent glances toward the envelope. Subtlety in Weatherby St. Clair was both shield and instrument. A small remark from Miss Trelawney prompted further reflection. "It occurs to me," she said, carefully neutral, "that some contributions may reflect social obligation rather than genuine inclination." Though phrased as an observation rather than accusation, it elicited subtle reactions. Hands shifted, a faint cough, a momentary straightening of posture. Purbright catalogued the responses silently, appreciating the efficiency with which civility could produce insight without confrontation. The envelope remained quietly central, a locus of observation. Its movements, the subtle glances it elicited, and the slight alterations in posture and tone surrounding it were sufficient to reveal the contours of social anxiety. Each minor gesture was evidence, each hesitation a clue, and each glance a confirmation that the village's carefully maintained equilibrium had begun to respond to unseen pressures. As the meeting drew toward a conclusion, Mrs. Darnley made a final suggestion concerning the wording of the parish newsletter, phrased in careful neutrality. Her recommendation, indirect yet weighty, produced quiet assent, and the sense that her influence had subtly realigned the committee's priorities. Purbright noted with mild satisfaction that her calm authority functioned as both guide and arbiter, shaping outcomes without recourse to overt instruction. Upon departure, the committee members executed the rituals of civility with precision. Nods, bows, and brief acknowledgments conveyed propriety. Yet beneath these gestures lay undercurrents of reflection and consideration. Purbright lingered, noting subtle adjustments in posture and the fleeting micro-expressions that betrayed thought, apprehension, and cautious calculation. Even as appearances remained intact, the village's social currents had shifted ever so slightly. Walking along the lanes toward his lodgings, Purbright reflected on the unfolding patterns. The envelope, minor though it seemed, had already influenced behavior in multiple directions: hesitation, subtle inquiry, and quiet assertion of attention. The villagers, he observed, were as much participants in a network of observation as they were in formal actions. Reputation, civility, and discretion functioned as instruments, shaping behavior far more than any overt measure could. At his lodgings, Purbright catalogued the day's observations, noting each micro-reaction, glance, and hesitation. The envelope's faint smudge, the subtle repositioning, and the nearly imperceptible handling suggested attention, intention, and perhaps caution. It had moved through the meeting like a silent arbiter, provoking reflection and minor anxiety without speech or accusation. In a village governed by propriety, such instruments were far more potent than direct declaration. As evening descended, the inspector returned to the envelope one final time. Its presence, combined with the series of minor reactions it had elicited, represented a quiet accumulation of influence, the shaping of thought and behavior through subtle, nearly invisible means. Purbright considered the faintest wrinkle along its edge, suggesting multiple, deliberate interactions. The gesture was slight, almost imperceptible, yet it carried potential significance in the measured social economy of Weatherby St. Clair. The day concluded with no scandal, no confrontation, and no revelation. Yet beneath the calm surface, a gentle tension had begun to accumulate. Micro-reactions, subtle shifts in behavior, and the quiet circulation of observation had produced a faintly altered equilibrium. And in the inspector's mind, a single question lingered, delicate and unresolved. Who had handled the envelope, and with what unspoken purpose? In a village where civility concealed as much as it revealed, the answer would emerge, not in spectacle, but through the patient accumulation of subtle signs, gestures, and calculated reflection. The chapter ended with the faintest indication of change. As Purbright noted the slight shift of the envelope upon the ledger, he recognized it as more than chance. A hand had brushed it, tentatively, perhaps uncertainly, perhaps deliberately. The village's intricate choreography of observation and reputation was quietly in motion, and the inspector, as always, would observe with deliberate patience the unfolding consequences of even the smallest gesture. The day began in Wetherby St. Clair with an unusual clarity. Sunlight, thin and polite, fell across the stone cottages, illuminating the narrow lanes without dispelling the lingering sense of social tension that had quietly accumulated over recent days. Inspector Purbright, walking toward the parish hall, noted the precision with which every detail of village life maintained its curated order, shutters aligned, chimneys smoke-free, and garden gates closed with the faintest sense of ceremony. Even in tranquility, the village seemed to vibrate with a subtle undercurrent of observation, each resident's posture, glance, and hesitation quietly catalogued by the others. Upon arrival, Purbright found Father Llewellyn examining a collection of letters pinned to the notice board. His expression was composed, yet the slight narrowing of his eyes indicated scrutiny. "Inspector," he said with his habitual mild authority, "the village has begun to converse in whispers rather than words. One suspects that the circulation of letters and minor gestures is now influencing perception more than direct communication ever could." Purbright inclined his head, acknowledging that subtlety and indirect influence were often more powerful than overt action in Wetherby St. Clair. Mrs. Darnley entered shortly after, her posture impeccable, her gloved hands lightly folded. "There has been comment," she began, her voice perfectly neutral yet edged with anticipation, "regarding the arrival of certain correspondence. While no impropriety is apparent, one must remain attentive to the perceptions of those who observe rather than participate." Purbright noted the elegance of her phrasing. No accusation, merely an invitation to consider the ripples produced by small acts, gestures, or the handling of letters. The parish committee assembled in their usual order, each member executing their entrance with quiet precision. Mr. Collingwood's eyes immediately sought the cream-coloured envelope, now resting in the ledger's centre, with the faint suggestion of prior handling. Miss Trelawney entered with her customary measured nod, lips compressed slightly in thought, and Mrs. Darnley, serene in appearance, swept her gaze across the room with the imperceptible weight of evaluation. Even Father Llewellyn's calm demeanour betrayed a hint of anticipation as he observed the subtle choreography of civility and attention. The meeting began ostensibly focused on routine parish matters, allocations of donations, schedules for the upcoming fete, and the content of the parish newsletter. Yet, as Purbright observed, these subjects served as a backdrop for more telling phenomena. Each phrase, each correction, and each pause was measured, designed to reveal allegiance, moral stance, or subtle judgment without ever breaching decorum. Micro-reactions, half-smiles, brief glances, fingers tapping pens, communicated far more than the spoken words. Mr. Collingwood raised a minor procedural point regarding the distribution of contributions. "It may be prudent," he said with mild hesitation, "to ensure that distribution reflects not only need but the proprieties of recognition." His phrasing, polite and measured, invited reflection while asserting the subtle primacy of reputation. Miss Trelawney responded, her tone gentle, almost deferential yet precise. Indeed, though one might consider that undue attention risks undermining the dignity of both giver and recipient. The interplay was polite, indirect, yet laden with unspoken commentary. Mrs. Darnley observed silently for a moment, then intervened with characteristic subtlety. "Perhaps a balance may be struck," she suggested, allowing recognition without undue display. The impression left upon the observer often carries more weight than the act itself. Purbright noted how her words functioned as both guide and arbiter, shaping decisions with quiet authority while maintaining the appearance of neutrality. A small envelope, previously unnoticed, shifted slightly near the ledger, eliciting micro-reactions from multiple parties. Mr. Collingwood's pen paused, Miss Trelawney's gaze lingered, and Father Llewellyn's lips compressed momentarily. The envelope, trivial in content yet charged with latent influence, had become an unacknowledged actor in the room. Its mere presence evoked hesitation, reflection, and subtle recalibration of behaviour. Purbright catalogued each motion with meticulous attention, a half-inch slide, a faint crease, the nearly imperceptible hesitation of a hand hovering over it. Discussion moved toward the scheduling of committee visits to parishioners. Each suggestion was phrased in neutral language, yet beneath the surface, moral and social anxieties were subtly expressed. Mr. Faraday advocated efficiency, his phrasing polite but assertive, signalling his interest in control. Miss Trelawney offered consideration for comfort and propriety, gently asserting a moral perspective. Even small disagreements were performed within a framework of civility, rendering the negotiation of authority invisible to the casual observer, yet transparent to the trained eye. Father Llewellyn, in a voice as calm as the morning air, observed, "One wonders if our actions are guided more by precedent and expectation than by necessity. Observation, as much as intention, informs outcome." The statement was framed as mild reflection, yet it prompted subtle self-scrutiny among the committee members. Heads tilted, fingers flexed, and posture adjusted, a silent dialogue of perception, obligation, and propriety unfolded without words. Tea was served mid-morning, a ritual executed with the same precision as every other act in Wetherby St. Clair. Cups were aligned, biscuits presented symmetrically, and the occasional clink of porcelain punctuated measured conversation. Mr. Collingwood's hand hovered over the ledger, brushing briefly against the cream-coloured envelope, while Miss Trelawney's eyes followed the motion with polite restraint. Even Father Llewellyn, usually serene, exhibited the faintest tightening of lips, a subtle acknowledgement of awareness and anticipation. A minor remark introduced by Miss Trelawney further rippled through the room. "It is conceivable," she said, measured and polite, "that some contributions are offered in response to obligation rather than inclination." The statement, entirely courteous, produced quiet micro-reactions. An adjustment of chairs, a brief tightening of hands around teacups, the slight clearing of a throat. Purbright, noting each subtle motion, catalogued these as signs of social unease, reflection, and cautious evaluation of moral conduct. The cream-coloured envelope, largely ignored in conversation but central to behaviour, had quietly influenced the assembly. Micro-reactions, hesitation, and subtle gestures provided evidence of the interplay of attention, reputation, and discretion. Its role as silent instigator underscored the village's reliance on observation, inference, and propriety as instruments of influence. As the meeting concluded, Mrs. Darnley offered a final, understated suggestion regarding the phrasing of the newsletter. Her recommendation, carefully indirect, produced quiet assent and aligned the committee's priorities without overt assertion. Purbright noted the elegance of her influence. Minor adjustments, subtly imposed, producing the desired social and moral outcomes. When the committee departed, civility remained intact. Nods, bows, and polite phrases conveyed propriety, yet beneath these gestures lay subtle reflection, minor concern, and quiet calculation. Purbright lingered, observing faint changes in posture, glance, and composure, evidence of the continuing negotiation of perception, reputation, and influence. Even as the village maintained its appearance of tranquil order, the undercurrents of attention and anticipation persisted. Walking back along the now sunny lanes, Purbright reflected on the patterns emerging, the cream-coloured envelope, the minor discrepancies and the micro-reactions had subtly altered behaviour and perception. The villagers, as much participants as observers, were quietly engaged in maintaining equilibrium while navigating minor anxieties and moral expectations. Each gesture, glance, and pause was a conduit of influence, shaping outcomes in ways far more potent than overt pronouncement could achieve. At his lodgings, Purbright catalogued the observations of the morning, noting each micro-reaction, glance, and hesitation. The envelope's faint smudge, its subtle displacement, and the tentative handling by multiple individuals were silent clues, evidence of intention, observation, and cautious calculation. In Wetherby St. Clair, the unseen was often more consequential than the seen, and the smallest gestures could reshape social equilibrium without a single dramatic event. As evening fell, Purbright returned once more to the envelope. The subtle crease along its edge, the faint impression of a finger, suggested it had been handled more than once, tentatively, with varying degrees of certainty. The gesture was minor, almost imperceptible, yet it carried potential significance, a silent indication of attention, a prompt toward reflection, and a quiet acknowledgement that influence, once exercised, begins to ripple. The day concluded without spectacle, scandal, or confrontation. Yet the undercurrents of the village had shifted in the quietest manner possible. Micro-reactions, subtle recalibrations, and the silent circulation of observation produced a faintly altered equilibrium. In Purbright's mind, a single question lingered. Who had handled the envelope, and with what unspoken purpose? In Wetherby St. Clair, civility concealed as much as it revealed, and the accumulation of subtle signs, gestures, and careful reflection would, over time, disclose truths that direct investigation could not. The chapter ended with the faintest indication of change, a subtle shift in the envelope's position, a crease suggesting intent, and the nearly imperceptible imprint of a fingertip. The village's intricate choreography of observation and moral negotiation was quietly in motion, and Inspector Purbright, as always, would watch patiently as its consequences unfolded. The morning in Wetherby St. Clair carried a peculiar stillness, the sort that suggested observation more than movement. Inspector Purbright noted the absence of the usual small noises, the distant clatter of a milk jug, the faint rustle of laundry flapping in a cautious breeze, replaced by the soft, measured footfalls of villagers who seemed to be circulating in anticipation rather than routine. It was the kind of day when reputations, long considered stable, began to flex under the weight of rumour, suggestion, and the subtle pressure of communal attention. Purbright arrived at the parish hall to find Mrs. Darnley arranging the notice board with her usual precision. Her gloved hands adjusted a set of meeting notices with the care of one handling fragile porcelain. "Inspector," she said, voice impeccably neutral, "there has been some conversation regarding recent correspondence. While I am certain no impropriety is evident, the perceptions of the village are, as ever, delicate." She allowed a faint pause, giving the words the gravity of an unspoken question. Perception often outweighed fact. Father Llewellyn arrived shortly after, carrying a ledger that appeared innocuous, yet was, as Purbright knew, a repository of observation and influence. "Good morning," he said, inclining his head. "It appears our correspondence has set subtle ripples. The envelope, though minor in itself, has caused reflection upon reflection. The village seems more attentive than usual to small acts." Purbright acknowledged the statement with a small nod, aware that indirect commentary often revealed more than direct scrutiny could. The committee assembled in the hall with their usual careful choreography. Mr. Collingwood's eyes immediately sought the cream-coloured envelope, now subtly repositioned on the ledger, suggesting handling in the absence of others. Miss Trelawney entered, with her characteristic composure, lips slightly pressed, as if measuring both her own restraint and the anticipated behaviour of the others. Mrs. Darnley's gaze, sweeping the room, carried the faintest trace of inquiry, silent yet unyielding. The morning's discussion opened with the review of minor parish expenditures, each item catalogued with the precise attention befitting public scrutiny. Mr. Faraday, noting the recent influx of letters, proposed slight adjustments to the budget allocations for events, framed entirely as concern for practical efficiency. Miss Trelawney, however, countered with the gentle assertion that perception and propriety should guide such decisions. The exchange, polite yet taut, revealed subtle tension between efficiency and the village's delicate moral economy. Purbright observed the minor signals of unease, a hand lingering over a pen, a fleeting adjustment of posture, the faint tightening of lips. Each micro-reaction was evidence, a coded language of hesitation, propriety, and moral calculation. The cream-coloured envelope, silent yet central, had become an agent of reflection, guiding attention in ways more effective than any verbal admonition. Father Llewellyn interjected, his tone mild but pointed. "One might note that small actions, while seemingly trivial, are often imbued with meaning precisely because they are unnoticed. The handling of correspondence, the ordering of an envelope, these may provoke as much thought as overt discourse." The statement elicited subtle acknowledgement. Mr. Collingwood's slight tilt of the head, Miss Trelawney's measured glance, and a faint nod from Mrs. Darnley. In Wetherby St. Clair, observation and inference were instruments more potent than explicit declaration. Attention turned to the upcoming parish fete, a topic ostensibly mundane, yet rich with latent implication. Discussions of table placement, musical arrangements, and seating for visitors were laced with indirect moral commentary. Mr. Faraday's insistence on early set-up carried the faintest assertion of authority. Miss Trelawney's gentle emphasis on decorum and comfort countered this, reinforcing the subtle moral hierarchy among participants. Purbright noted how even these minor disputes conveyed assessment of character, propriety, and influence. A minor disruption occurred when a village note, anonymous and folded neatly, appeared atop the ledger beside the cream-coloured envelope. The note was unremarkable in appearance, yet the micro-reactions it provoked were far from trivial. Mr. Collingwood's hand hovered briefly before retreating. Miss Trelawney's eyes registered recognition without overt comment, and Father Llewellyn's lips compressed almost imperceptibly. The note's arrival, though silent and indirect, had begun to introduce a ripple of moral scrutiny into the assembly. Mrs. Darnley allowed a deliberate pause before speaking. While the content of correspondence need not disturb us, the awareness it produces may be instructive. Observation, as always, carries its own responsibilities. The words, calm and courteous, functioned as both guidance and gentle admonition. Purbright recognized the skill in her phrasing, no overt command, yet a subtle shaping of attention and propriety had occurred. Tea was served in the usual ritualized manner, each cup aligned precisely, biscuits placed symmetrically, and the soft clink of porcelain marking punctuated moments of conversation. Micro-gestures became the language of reflection. A hand brushing briefly over the ledger, a subtle adjustment of a sleeve, a faintly prolonged gaze toward the cream-coloured envelope and its accompanying note. In such moments, observation supplanted words as the instrument of inquiry. A seemingly casual remark from Miss Trelawney, "Some may act from obligation rather than inclination," elicited further micro-reactions. Heads shifted subtly, fingers flexed around teacups, and a cough broke the momentary silence. The polite neutrality of her words concealed moral evaluation, prompting reflection without accusation. Purbright catalogued each movement, aware that subtle signals often carried the weight of revelation in Weatherby St. Clair. The envelope, the note, and the patterns of attention had transformed a routine meeting into an arena of silent moral scrutiny. Each gesture, each slight hesitation, each glance became a data point in a network of observation. The village's equilibrium, long maintained through civility, was quietly realigning under the weight of reflection and social expectation. As the meeting drew to a close, Mrs. Darnley offered one final suggestion regarding phrasing in the parish newsletter. Her tone was gentle, her phrasing indirect, yet it produced instant acknowledgement and near-universal assent. Purbright noted the effect. Social priorities realigned without a word of argument, the influence of subtle guidance more potent than the blunt instrument of command. Upon departure, committee members executed the rituals of civility with customary precision. Nods, bows, and brief acknowledgments communicated propriety, yet beneath these gestures lingered reflection, moral contemplation, and subtle evaluation of behavior. Even as appearances remained intact, Purbright noted the invisible shifts, the tiny flexes of posture, and the fleeting glances that revealed the movement of social currents beneath the surface. Walking along the sunlit lanes toward his lodgings, Purbright reflected on the morning's observations. The envelopes, notes, and subtle reactions had quietly redirected attention, reshaped perception, and reminded the villagers of the weight of observation. In Weatherby St. Clair, reputation was constantly negotiated, each gesture a contribution to moral calculus, each minor discrepancy or micro-reaction a potential revelation in waiting. At his lodgings, Purbright reviewed his notes. The cream-coloured envelope bore a faint smudge and an imperceptible crease, evidence of handling perhaps tentative, perhaps deliberate. The accompanying note had provoked a ripple of reflection and subtle apprehension. Each micro-reaction, posture, glance, hesitation, was now a silent clue to motivations, awareness, and the careful calibration of attention in a community where observation governed morality more than any formal rule. Evening settled over the village with calm precision, yet a subtle tension lingered. Micro-reactions, small adjustments, and silent observations accumulated, quietly influencing perception and expectation. Purbright considered a final, almost imperceptible clue. The crease along the envelope's edge suggested handling that had not been casual. Someone had interacted with it with a degree of uncertainty, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps intent. In the absence of confrontation, the ripple of this minor gesture was already propagating through the moral and social network of the village. The day concluded with no overt scandal, no argument, and no revelation. And yet beneath the polished exterior of Weatherby St. Clair, subtle shifts had occurred. Reputation, attention, and expectation had been nudged by the circulation of letters and envelopes, and by the quiet, watchful responses of those involved. Purbright recognized that answers would not emerge suddenly, but through patient observation of patterns, gestures, and the accumulation of small, seemingly trivial acts. The chapter closed with the faintest indication of change, a slight alteration in the envelope's position on the ledger, the crease suggesting deliberate handling, and the faint impression of a fingertip at one corner. The village's quiet choreography of observation and moral negotiation was subtly in motion, and Inspector Purbright, as always, would watch with measured patience as these minor gestures rippled toward consequences yet unseen. The morning was unusually bright for Wetherby St. Clair, the sun illuminating stone and brick with a soft, impartial clarity that left no shadow unexamined. Inspector Purbright, strolling along the village lanes, noted the meticulous order of gardens, the taut laundry, and the even spacing of hedges. It was as if the village itself had gathered composure in anticipation of observation, as though aware that subtle truths might soon emerge. For weeks he had catalogued hesitation, glances, and the circulation of letters, and now, at last, the village seemed prepared, if unknowingly, to reveal the patterns he had long suspected. The parish hall was quiet upon his arrival, its polished floor reflecting the morning light. Mrs. Darnley was already present, adjusting the notice board with that careful attention that suggested the orchestration of both order and perception. "Inspector," she said, her voice measured and polite, "the villagers are beginning to note small irregularities. There is no cause for alarm, but attention is shifting. Subtle observation is now reciprocated." Purbright noted the faint emphasis on reciprocated, as if she implied that the watchers themselves were about to be watched. Father Llewellyn entered shortly thereafter, carrying the ledger that had so often served as both record and instrument. "Good morning," he said, inclining his head. "It seems the envelopes and correspondence have produced reflection as much as they have speculation. Observation, it appears, is now influencing behaviour even more than intention." His phrasing, polite and indirect, allowed Purbright to recognize both the clarity of the situation and the restraint of its presentation. The cream-coloured envelope, accompanied by its subtle crease and faint smudge, rested at the centre of the ledger, as if claiming its role in the morning's proceedings. Mr. Collingwood arrived, eyes immediately seeking it, noting the slight shift in its position, the almost imperceptible imprint of a fingertip at its edge. Miss Trelawney followed, her posture precise, her lips compressed slightly, as though preparing to measure both propriety and subtle disclosure. Even Father Llewellyn's serene gaze betrayed faint anticipation. Purbright, observing, catalogued the ensemble of gestures, a choreography of civility shaped by curiosity, concern, and silent moral negotiation. The meeting began with discussion of the parish fete, ostensibly a logistical concern, but in reality a canvas upon which reputation, observation, and minor rivalry might be assessed. Mr. Faraday advocated early set-up, phrasing it as efficiency, yet his insistence carried the faint undertone of authority. Miss Trelawney, attentive to propriety and moral optics, suggested that the comfort of participants and decorum of presentation were equally significant. Each exchange, polite yet deliberate, reflected more than the surface. Topic: micro-evaluations of character, judgment, and influence were interwoven into the conversation. Mrs. Darnley observed in silence for a moment, then intervened. Perhaps a careful balance may reconcile efficiency and propriety. One's attention to both effect and impression ensures no misjudgment occurs. Her words, gentle yet weighted, guided the assembly without force, subtly shaping outcomes while preserving appearances. Purbright, noting the elegance of her influence, recorded the slight shifts in posture, gaze, and subtle emphasis that confirmed her authority was both recognized and unresisted. Attention then turned inevitably to the envelopes and the minor note that had appeared the previous day. The small piece of paper rested beside the cream-coloured envelope, its presence discreet yet consequential. Mr. Collingwood's hand paused above it, as if uncertain whether to reveal knowledge or maintain restraint. Miss Trelawney's eyes flicked toward it briefly, then away, signalling acknowledgment without explicit disclosure. Even Father Llewellyn's expression, carefully composed, betrayed a faintly compressed lip, the minimal sign of internal consideration. The room itself seemed to slow in recognition of the significance of these quiet instruments. Purbright, observing, noted the cumulative effect of minor gestures, glances, and hesitations. Each individual movement, though insignificant in isolation, contributed to a tableau of reflection, awareness, and subtle moral calculation. The cream-coloured envelope, with its crease, faint smudge, and carefully handled presents, had quietly governed the morning's proceedings, drawing attention, eliciting observation, and shaping behaviour without word or accusation. A subtle conversation arose, framed entirely within politeness and measured reflection. Miss Trelawney remarked, "One might consider that the origin of such correspondence is itself a reflection upon the community. Awareness of minor irregularities, even in absence of evidence, can guide conduct." The phrasing was neutral, yet the statement elicited a quiet ripple of micro-reactions. The adjustment of a sleeve, a brief inhale, the faint clearing of a throat. These gestures were silent acknowledgement of the underlying social evaluation, their civility maintained, yet their attention fully engaged. Mrs. Darnley allowed a measured pause, then added, "Observation is as much a moral act as any. How one perceives, reflects, and responds shapes the reputations of all. In attending to minor signs, we attend to the village itself." The words, elegantly phrased, reinforced the unspoken principle that subtlety, vigilance, and propriety governed social equilibrium as much as any explicit action. Purbright noted with faint amusement how civility concealed as much as it disclosed. Tea was served mid-morning, ritualized as always, cups were aligned, biscuits arranged symmetrically, and porcelain clinked softly as participants accepted the beverage. Mr. Collingwood's hand hovered briefly over the envelope before withdrawing. Miss Trelawney's eyes followed, and Father Llewellyn's lips compressed in quiet observation. Each gesture, no matter how slight, carried meaning. Purbright catalogued them silently, intention, uncertainty, and the negotiation of propriety expressed in micro-movement. A minor remark from Miss Trelawney introduced a subtle tension. One might observe that even unremarkable correspondence may influence perception more than content alone. Heads shifted imperceptibly, a pen hovered, and lips pressed briefly in reflection. Purbright recognized the precision of her phrasing, a statement neutral in form, potent in effect, eliciting consideration without confrontation. The envelopes, notes, and micro-reactions had accumulated into a pattern that now revealed an invisible hierarchy of attention. The village's equilibrium, maintained for decades through civility and observation, was subtly shifting under the pressure of accumulated knowledge, reflection, and moral scrutiny. Purbright, noting the convergence of behavior, micro-gestures, and minor evidence, recognized that the moment of subtle revelation was approaching. Mrs. Darnley, allowing a deliberate pause, gestured faintly toward the envelope. "Perhaps it is time to consider what we know, what we assume, and what we might infer. Small instruments can reveal larger truths if one observes attentively." Her phrasing was courteous, indirect, yet unmistakable in intent. The envelope, trivial in appearance, had become a mirror of attention, perception, and social consequence. Purbright moved to examine the envelope and note with quiet care. The crease along its edge, the faint smudge, and the subtle impression of a fingertip indicated multiple interactions, tentative yet deliberate. Cross-referencing these observations with micro-reactions across the committee suggested a pattern. Interest tempered by civility, hesitation tempered by propriety, and attention calibrated against the perceived moral weight of the act. Each minor gesture now assumed significance in the social and psychological calculus of the village. The final conversation of the morning unfolded, measured and understated. Mr. Collingwood admitted, in precise phrasing, that he had touched the envelope, not out of curiosity, but as a minor necessity of record-keeping. Miss Trelawney acknowledged without elaboration that she had considered the note with polite attention, but refrained from further action. Father Llewellyn confirmed that he, too, had observed the instruments and reflected upon their implications without interference. The revelation was small, almost trivial, yet it illuminated the interplay of observation, hesitation, and silent moral consideration that had guided the week's events. As the committee departed, civility remained intact. Bows, nods, and courteous phrases conveyed propriety. Yet Purbright, standing slightly apart, noted the subtle shifts in posture, the brief glances toward the envelope, and the faint relaxation of shoulders, tiny signals indicating acknowledgement, reflection, and minor realignment of attention. Even in closure, the village's equilibrium was dynamically engaged, responding to observation and to the consequences of prior inattention. Walking home along sunlit lanes, Purbright reflected on the accumulation of subtle evidence. The envelopes and notes, the minor micro-reactions, and the deliberate gestures had revealed a pattern of influence far more effective than overt intervention could achieve. The village, in maintaining civility, had disclosed the full measure of attention, propriety, and moral negotiation through the quietest channels. Each gesture, glance, and hesitation was a revelation in its own right. At his lodgings, Purbright catalogued the evidence with care. The envelope, its crease, faint smudge, and fingerprint provided a final set of observations confirming the delicate balance of attention and propriety in Weatherby St. Clair. The minor acts of handling, reflection, and observation had created a tableau in which reputation, morality, and perception intersected seamlessly, without spectacle, without confrontation, yet with full disclosure. The chapter and the investigation concluded not with drama but with a quiet acknowledgement. Small gestures, subtle observation, and indirect evidence had revealed patterns of behavior that overt scrutiny could never have elicited. The cream-colored envelope, trivial in appearance, had governed attention, provoked reflection, and guided moral consideration through its silent presence. In the village, civility concealed as much as it revealed, and understanding required patience, attention, and a steady eye. The final clue, almost imperceptible, lay in the faint crease at the corner of the envelope, a single touch, tentative yet deliberate, indicating intention and observation. In that small gesture, Purbright discerned the convergence of curiosity, propriety, and moral calculation. The village's intricate dance of reputation and attention had quietly reached its first moment of clarity, leaving the inspector to observe, reflect, and catalogue the consequences that would ripple outward, imperceptible yet undeniable.